Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Is green a red and blue construct? Put another way, is there a political partisan divide over the environment? This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. That's a particularly interesting question, no doubt more so in recent years, as the country seems to have drifted farther and farther apart because of our political beliefs. To that point, a reader reached out the other day to say our stories shouldn't be negative on the Trump administration because the national parks are going to need the help of all of us, Democrats, Republicans, independents, and everything in between, to survive. But are environmental issues highly partisan? For the traveler's purpose, we'll define environmental issues as those focused on public lands, wildlife, clean air, clean water, and of course the national parks. To help us try and answer that question, our guest today is Caleb Scoville, a professor at Tufts University who has received an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship to explore that question. We'll be back in a minute with Caleb.
The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Welcome to the Traveler, Caleb.
Thanks for having me.
It's great. You're diving into an interesting topic. Congratulations on the Carnegie Fellowship. That's quite the prize. What exactly was your pitch that caught their attention?
Yeah, well, I think the folks at Carnegie are particularly interested in understanding polarization and political division in America and coming up with ways to address that problem. And so they're deeply concerned with the state of our democracy, and so they use their funds to support research and advocacy that can hopefully address the divides that are sort of testing and creating problems for our political institutions and our public culture. And I'm someone who's interested in these topics as well, but I've been working on environmental issues and environmental conflicts for some time, and I was thinking that they would probably be interested in something on the environment, particularly given that the climate crisis is one of the biggest problems of our time generally, and in how environmental issues became integrated into the partisan landscape. So my pitch was to study how the environment, which was an issue that I say the environment, but environmental issues broadly, was an issue area that a few decades ago was one that had really broad bipartisan support, right? Environmental regulation and protection, and then that became one of the more sharply divisive issue areas fairly recently. I wanted to understand how that happened. That's the broad point. Now, there is a lot of work already on this topic, but when I taught a seminar on anti-environmentalism at Tufts, and something I noticed when I was reading that work was that a lot of it was really fantastic, but it was almost too environmental. Like it was focused on environmental issues in isolation. And so my pitch was to understand not simply if and how and in what ways and how we became divided over environmental issues, but also how our relationship as Americans and as partisans to environmental issues is connected to other issues and other identities. So how environmental divisions are woven into a broader kind of partisan fabric that increasingly defines people in terms of us and them. So I see the sort of construction of partisan identities as a historical process and as a cultural process. And I see environmental issues as one sort of important puzzle piece in how that sort of became constructed. And that's a slightly different orientation than I think most research on environmental politics takes, which is more just to look at sort of which party has more, supports environmental protection more or less. Do people agree with the scientific consensus on climate change and so on? So that's sort of what I suggested, basically bringing environmental issues in relation to a whole host of other hot button issues, but also those kind of broader sort of identities that we associate with partisanship.
I'm curious. You mentioned that we weren't always so partisan environmentally. You can go back to the 1960s, the late 1960s, when President Nixon was in office, and before him, President Johnson signed into law the Wilderness Act, and President Nixon, I believe, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act,
Endangered Species Act.
Endangered Species Act, National Environmental Policy Act. Was there a clear divide chronologically when things started to fall apart in terms of partisanship and the environment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think there were always there's always been environmental conflict, right? I mean, so I think it's important to sort of separate like conflict over these issues versus their partisan nature. And I think this is sort of gets to the heart of what I'm interested in. So, if you go back to the, long history, even before the period you mentioned, of the foundation of the national parks. There's some great sort of historical sociological work. I don't know if you're familiar with this book by Justin Farrell, The Battle for Yellowstone. Basically, it's a history of Yellowstone that shows that, the question of what is Yellowstone and what is nature is something that has divided people for a very long time. And that goes back to the dispossession of indigenous people in the Americas, but it also represents conflict among different waves of settlers that came after. So conflict and environment, are tied up partly because we're talking about natural resources, we're talking about land, we're talking about, belonging and citizenship and political freedom. But yeah, it wasn't really. I don't think that issue became defined in partisan terms until much later. So yeah, I mean, I always like to kind of, shock people who may not know this history by just saying that, yeah, President Nixon was probably the greatest environmental president in American history, not necessarily because he was great or that he particularly cared about these issues, but because these issues hadn't become aligned in the way they are today. And I think that part of this is hard for me to say with a lot of authority because I mainly rely on reading the work of others, and a lot of this I will try to unpack in my own way when I undertake this study, which is only just beginning. But I think a big part of the shift comes really after that, right? Partly in reaction to the unintended or unforeseen consequences of some of those laws, right? Understanding the complexities of, say, applying the Endangered Species Act, and then it turns out there's a whole set of constituencies that are affected, and how are we gonna manage those effects, and also what kinds of political opportunities are created through those effects. So I think, to get back to your question, I think the Reagan administration was really when things started to shift, and when the kind of Republican Party adopted a really strong deregulatory approach to a whole host of issues, economic and otherwise, and the environment became one of many sites where deregulation became the Republican Party's project.
You know, I chuckled when you said President Nixon was the most environmentally responsible president. You can go back, and a lot of people will point to Theodore Roosevelt as the most environmentally green president in terms of the lands that he protected in both national parks and forests, national forests. And it's interesting, you know, there's an ebb and flow that goes back at least 100, 125 years. Roosevelt in 1909, he had a report from the National Conservation Commission that he wrote a cover letter for Congress. And part of that letter says, if we of this generation destroy the resources from which our children would otherwise derive their livelihood, we reduce the capacity of our land to support a population, and so either degrade the standard of living or deprive the coming generations of their right to life on this continent. I mean, this was back in 1909, and Roosevelt thought we were running out of land back then. Zoom forward to 2025, and we have an administration that wants to drill baby drill, mine baby mine, log baby log, public lands, federal lands. And there are, you know, some in the Republican Party that believe that the federal government owns too much land and it should divest it by selling it to the states or whomever. Haven't seen the final line on that. But it's an interesting, you know, trying to track that ebb and flow through history. I mean, there's ups and there's downs, and it must make it hard for you to chart your course in terms of, you know, what answers to what questions you're seeking.
Yeah. So I mean, this is great. I mean, I think you're right. You know, there are ebbs and flows in the longer history of the United States in terms of understanding sort of, you know, my sort of focus is primarily on, we started talking about Nixon, you know, kind of Nixon forward, because that's sort of the beginning of the sort of era of the flagship environmental laws, modern environmental laws that, you know, we both rely on and are also under attack today. So, but certainly the history, you could take the history back much further, and I think there are a lot of echoes of those older conflicts, you know, today, even though they might appear a bit different. You know, so I'm a sociologist, and it's a very open-ended discipline. There's a lot of different ways we could do this. I do rely heavily on the work of others who have done, you know, deep archival work in addition to, or also like a lot of work on public opinion. So we have a lot of really good polling on this stuff. But I'm really interested in sort of what people what people actually say and do, right? You know, we only tend to ask polling questions when something is already kind of an established controversy or a settled matter or something that we are sort of agree, you know, we should be asking. And so the kind of focus of this project is to look at sort of the record of all the things that have been said and done about environmental issues, and to sort of build a large sort of corpus of data and to analyze it systematically. And so for instance, the congressional record, right? It's available going back, you know, for a very long time. So if we take, and I'm working on this with my collaborator, Andrew McCumber, who's better at computational methods than I am. We take the entire sort of congressional record for many decades, which is essentially all the things that are said in the House and Senate on the record. And we can try to understand how environmental issues were talked about, right, at different times in history, right, and how they were linked to other issues, and also how they were connected to partisanship, right? Both understanding who said what, but also how they're discussed. So that's one way to kind of concretize this, is to find places where there's a lot of speech, right? And the congressional record is one of them. And I can also talk about some of the other ones that we're looking at. What's interesting to me about that space is we can understand both, you know, how environmental issues are discussed, but also how they're connected to partisan animosity. So one of the big, just kind of stepping back, you know, one of the big findings of work on political division in the United States, beyond environment, just in general, right, is that while we are divided over Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservative, we are divided on our issue positions. Really, a lot of what makes our politics so toxic and divisive rests less on disagreement over particular issues and more on what political scientists call affective polarization. That is a sense of animosity toward the other side. And that isn't necessarily, it's often connected to issue positions, but it isn't necessarily attached to any particular issue. And often it's grounded in either misunderstanding of what the other side thinks, right? Exaggeration of how different they are, or even cues and facets of life that aren't even that political, right? Taste, right? Geography, class, other kind of forms of identity, and so I'm interested in how environmental issues became connected to that, right? So one of the ways that this shows up is the construction of the figure of the environmentalist, right, as a boogeyman, right, as a kind of negative symbol. And so understanding how environmentalism or environmentalist became something that we all tended to agree was generally a good thing or an okay thing, to being something that was a slur for at least one side of the political spectrum, and which issues became associated with that negativity is part of the project.
You mentioned the Reagan era and deregulation, and I think you can also go up to President Carter, and when he set aside all that land in Alaska and earned the animosity of a lot of Alaskans who thought that Carter was taking away their livelihoods. And I wonder, as the country has grown, the human footprint has become larger and larger, and so we passed the Environmental Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, the various environmental laws to protect, theoretically, what was left. And by doing that, it put more pressure on individuals trying to make their living from the land, so to speak, whether they were farmers or loggers or whatnot. And more roadblocks went up, theoretically, in the purpose of protecting what was left, what Roosevelt in 1909 told us we should protect because it was vanishing. Any merit to that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, and I think we, look. I mean, I come from a pretty environmentalist family, from a pretty liberal set. I live in Massachusetts, but I grew up in the far north of California in the redwood forest. And so I think, that setting allowed me to see kind of both sides of this, right? On the one hand, I grew up hearing we live in this kind of last remaining 1 or 2% of the old growth redwood forest. And isn't it special that we saved it? And I totally agree with that. But on the other hand, I also grew up in a place that, was based in a kind of extractive economy around logging primarily, but also fishing, that had essentially, the bottom had fallen out, and there was a lot of sort of economic dislocation associated both with that process, sort of in a way like coming to an end under its own weight by just over extraction, cutting down all the trees, but also because of environmental regulations that tried to save that last 1 or 2%. So I think, it is important to understand the trade-offs inherent in environmental regulation, and how, especially particularly in rural areas, right? There is a sense in which the government has hastened or exacerbated the decline of industries on which people rely. So I'm interested in that, and I think it's absolutely true. I also think that there's something else going on, which is these environmental laws, or the reaction to them, have also created political opportunities for people to tell stories. And so, like, one of my favorite, not in the sense that I agree with it, but like favorite like speeches in American history, or at least in modern American history, is Patrick Buchanan's culture war speech. And I don't know, a lot of people have read this speech, and I've read a lot of people who have talked about Buchanan's place in the history of modern conservatism. But I think few people have really pointed out the environmental dimension of this speech. So it's a speech that basically he talks about there being a war for the soul of America. This is after sort of just after the end of the Cold War, and in his wing of the Republican Party, he was basically saying, "Look, I'm not going to be the nominee. I'm going to put my weight behind George H.W. Bush," and but he provides a vision for what he thinks the Republican Party ought to focus on. And after the Cold War, there was a real opportunity in his mind to focus less on external enemies and more on internal enemies. And the environmentalist really becomes a part of that. Now, part of that he was responding to the Democratic ticket, because Al Gore was on the Democratic ticket as the vice president, and he was identified as an environmentalist, so he was poking fun at Al Gore. But he also mentioned people from my neck of the woods. So he talks about, let's see, what does he say? He says, so here we go. He says, there were the people of Hayfork, the tiny town up in California's Trinity Alps, a town that is now under a sentence of death because a federal judge has set aside 9 million acres for the habitat of the spotted owl, forgetting about the habitat of the men and women who live and work in Hayfork. So, it's interesting that he thought it was important to bring up that during his Republican National Convention speech. On the one hand, it's true that the people in Hayfork were being frustrated by federal regulations that were limiting the amount of logging they could do. That's true. But this is a very small number of people, right? And what he goes on to do after mentioning them is he mentions folks who were harmed in recent riots at the time he was writing in Los Angeles. And he calls these people are connected somehow as what he calls conservatives of the heart. And so what he's doing is he's not really speaking to the people of Hayfork or even necessarily the people of Los Angeles. What he's doing is he's articulating a kind of larger constituency, right, of people that he thinks were harmed by the excesses of liberalism or the excesses of progressivism or government, but in one case, and lawlessness in another. And I think that, his statement was kind of prescient in the way that it kind of prefigured a long-term approach, which is to take these kinds of evocative cases, which are really emotionally saturated, they're real, and to tell a story that makes some people, particularly people on the Republican and conservative side, feel as though they have a stake in this conflict and that they're on one side or another, right? Because most of us don't have a direct stake in this. Maybe we care about the spotted owl. Maybe we purchase things that are made of lumber, but we're not in Hayfork. But in my broader research, and I can talk about the work I've done on a different case, an endangered species case, I've seen that really these cases are really helpful for politicians and pundits to tell stories that really get people on board with a side, particularly for anti-environmental causes. Sort of the story of someone being, someone's livelihood being taken away for a non-human animal is an important story in this longer trajectory of partisanship in the environment.
No, for sure. And we're gonna look at that in a minute. We recently had a guest on our show, Walt Dabney, episode 323, for those who've missed it, who has been traveling the West largely to educate people on public lands and public lands issues and provide them with a better understanding of public land laws and why we have public lands. And, we talked a little bit about partisanship, and the one thing he mentioned was that the good thing about this to me politically is while it is truly political, if you're a four-wheel drive user, a backcountry horseman, a fisherman, a hunter, a mushroom collector, and he went on and on and on, you are every possible political background. So if that's the case, that would seem to give more weight to your argument about storytellers and how they use a little hyperbole in their story to gain political points. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to your prior guest's point, the National Park Service, I just looked up some recent data from Pew. The National Park Service is, at least among the large agencies that they ask about, is the most popular agency among the American public. And this is a really, cross-partisan agreement, right? So people like the National Park Service. They tend to think it's well run, and they view it favorably. So like, yeah, Republicans and Democrats agree. 75% of Republicans and 80% of Democrats view the National Park Service positively. So I think, that says something, right? And I think it speaks to your guest's point. Um, so I think, if you want to bring people together and gain support for, environmental protection, leaning on the reputation of the National Park Service, on the popularity of the parks, that they are for everyone, and that they allow people to do all sorts of things that they already like to do and already value, it's critical. At the same time, I do think that, more broadly, the question of public lands is one that has been divisive, right? What can be done on public lands? Particularly, I think it came up in your last show, the Sagebrush Rebellion. It was partly just sort of a set of like extractive industry interests, trying to tell a story about the relationship between the federal and state governments. But it also did, I think, speak to some popular sentiment, right? And it wells up from time and time again, right? So it's a complex issue, and part of it depends on like what you emphasize, right? So the National Park Service not being a regulatory agency, is less controversial than, say, the Environmental Protection Agency.
It seems highly controversial these days with what what the administration is trying to do. And to your point, it's the most beloved federal agency out there. Everybody loves national parks, and so you have to question why the administration is trying to defund the national park system, the National Park Service, and wipe out its workforce. I don't think you have an answer to that question. I don't think anybody does, because it's 1/15 of 1% of the federal budget. So why waste so much time doing that, unless you believe that the administration wants to privatize a lot of the parks? Do you think? I'll be curious to see if your research looks at a divide in the country, a geographical divide, and by that I mean the East Coast is developed. There's very few federal lands compared to the West. I grew up in New Jersey. I moved west back in '83. I've studied a lot of public lands issues since then. And I had friends back east who didn't know what the BLM was.
Mm.
And so I'm curious if that lack of knowledge spurs a lack of appreciation for federal lands. And that might
Yeah, I think
influence.
that's right. I mean, I think a lot of the divisions. So I don't have a perfect answer to your question about East-West. I do think that divide is real. I also think that, there's just in general like a tremendous geographic divide around partisanship in this country between cities and then more rural or suburban areas, right? And so all that creates the conditions, I think, for what we were talking about before, is like very divisive kinds of storytelling. So I think there are divisions there, but I think one of the big themes that comes up in my work is that, and one of the things I want to explore as I continue on this project, is a sense in which people view environmental regulation or environmentalists or the government as a kind of outside force, right? As something external. and as something that wants to kind of control or take away something that they care about, right? And so if you think about the kinds of stories that are told, if you go back to that one by Buchanan, or a number of times you hear about the kinds of stories that anti-environmentalists will tell, it's often that a sense that people who want to regulate sort of resource use, or set aside land from human interference or extraction, don't understand the ways of life of people in rural America. And so I think the fact that you have a sense of remoteness of decision making creates the opportunities for producing a lot of resentment. But I don't know if that's necessarily an east-west thing per se. I think it's more of a rural-urban divide.
So, do you think we just need better storytellers on the side of environmentalism? I mean, more Walt Dabney's traveling the country explaining these lands belong to all of us, and there are laws out there that protect those lands and protect our personal investment in them. Is it that simple?
Well, I don't think it's that simple, but I certainly don't think it would hurt. Again, I think that Americans generally, I mean, this is the paradox that you kind of pointed out, right? Americans already do really care about the national parks, right? And so that's really not the issue that people are divided over. It's more the role of environmental regulation, the priority that they place on addressing climate change. Those are the kinds of things that are particularly divisive. So yeah, I think storytelling helps, but I think it's also, I don't necessarily have the answer here, but I think that a big part of this is just how the partisan coalitions have changed over time, right? And how we've gone from well, first of all, how partisan narratives have become increasingly nationalized, right? And so rather than being grounded in like civic institutions at the local level, whether that's labor unions or even the Chamber of Commerce locally, to essentially national media, that has turned up the temperature on a lot of these issues, right? Where one controversy in one part of the country can be a source of meaning for people elsewhere, right? And there's not and there's a real disconnect, I think, between what people see the government doing, say, on television, and what they're actually seeing in their own lives, or whether it's social media or something else like that. So I think there's a lot of conditions that have sort of shifted the meaning of partisan identity, and that has sort of informed how people are engaging with environmental controversies. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm not making a lot of sense right now.
Yeah, really, we're trying to solve this problem today,
Yeah.
Caleb. It's not that big of an issue. You mentioned the nationalization of these issues, and I hate to say it. I've been a journalist for a long time, and over my 4+ decades of professional journalism, I've seen a frightening swing in how media portrays issues. When I went to school, it was, you tell both sides of the story, you don't take a position. And now, you can almost name the outlet, whether it's a national newspaper or a television program or a radio show, and you can pretty much say off the bat whether it's left-leaning or right-leaning. Certainly that's got to be fueling the flames of partisanship and over the environment.
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. So I think, there's a whole lot of choice that people have. They can sort of essentially pick whatever media outlet, and increasingly, YouTube influencer or whatever it is, that's going to give them the kind of interpretation of events that suits their already established way of understanding the world. And a lot of these things are extremely kind of outrage focused. They're focused on controversy. They're focused on emotion, and they're focused on us them narratives. And what we've lost, I think, is as you say, like these not only the kind of fact based and kind of complex stories, but also the locally rooted stories, and and the journalism at the local level. So yeah, I think that it both feeds on and exacerbates an environment of distrust, and I think that distrust is really at the root of a lot of these problems.
Going back to the geographical divide, I'll really be interested to see whether that does materialize in your research, because as I mentioned earlier, you go to the eastern half of the country and there's not a lot of public lands. You go to the west, and public lands are woven into the fabric of everyday life. And so, of course, you're going to have more issues. And so you have to wonder if people in Massachusetts, for instance, really have a position on some of these issues that are hot button issues in the West.
Yeah, it's true. It's true, but I mean, you also have, I mean, in Massachusetts, I think if you polled people, and I'm sure it's in there, you would have a lot of support for the parks and so on. So, um, I I don't know. I'm not really sure, It's sort of strange. It's sort of strange. It's not as though people in Massachusetts are apathetic toward these issues. And perhaps, I mean, this could be part of the issue that that yes, people genuinely care about addressing climate change. They genuinely care about environmental quality, but ultimately, because things have become so tightly sorted, right? That where you stand on the environment may just kind of be downstream of what your partisan affiliation is, right? Um, but the reality is, though, I think more complex when you get to really concrete issues. And so I think when you have a national park next door, it doesn't really matter what your abstract position is on the various environmental laws at the federal level, if you enjoy using that place, right? So I think I guess what it comes down to is to the extent that we are divided on environmental issues, we do need to sort of approach these things where people already are, right? And what they already value and what they already do. And so I think that's why it's important to go back to that quote from your previous guest, right? That people from all walks of life enjoy the parks.
Yeah. Let's go back to when you were working on your PhD dissertation, because that was a very specific case of environmental political conflict, water resources, endangered species conservation in California. What did that research show you?
Yeah, so I mean, in a lot of ways, this is kind of where I began to sort of develop the intuitions that I want to explore more today. So that my first book project, which I'm still finishing up and which began as my dissertation, was focused on the Delta smelt, which is a small endangered species of fish that only lives in the center of California's water distribution system, which is the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. So you probably know where the San Francisco Bay is. If you go inland a bit, that's where the major river systems of California converge. And there's a kind of brackish area called the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And in the mid 20th century, the federal and state governments cooperated to turn that into kind of the heart of California's water distribution system by both damming rivers, but also installing these gigantic pumps that essentially irrigate much of the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, which is the most productive agricultural region in the country, and it also provides water to Los Angeles and other highly populated areas like Silicon Valley. So it's an important site of extractive infrastructure. It's also a complex ecosystem, and when the government put in these pumps, it also produced a tremendous amount of scientific knowledge that would come back to bite it. And some of that was knowledge of a fish that until that point had not been even classified as a unique species, but came to be understood as one, the Delta smelt. And scientists began tracking the smelt sort of incidentally to other species. So the focus really at that time was on striped bass, which is a sports fish that people really valued for that reason because they like to catch it. And it's actually a non-native species, which is interesting. But through the data that was sort of collected to try to understand the health of the recreational and commercial fisheries, it became clear that the Delta smelt was in trouble. and it eventually became listed under the Endangered Species Act. And so my dissertation follows both the sort of relationship between extractive infrastructure and science. So how, our relationship to natural environment as something to use for, utilitarian purposes, in this case, water for agriculture in cities, also produces scientific knowledge, in this case, knowledge of a fish. But then that knowledge became a legal problem where it became listed under the Endangered Species Act, and it became the responsibility of the government to do everything it could to avoid jeopardizing the continued existence of that species, which meant less pumping of water from the delta, right? The Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, less water for farms and cities. Now, it's often exaggerated how much water the delta smelt, quote unquote, uses. In this case, it's lived there for thousands of years. So, we're the ones who transformed its habitat. It's a little funny to talk about it being the delta smelt's fault, but the delta smelt does account, protections of the delta smelt does account for some reductions in water available, and there's been a tremendous effort to sort of save the species and other endangered species living in the delta, including Chinook salmon, and those efforts have not been very successful. And so at one point, the conflict over the species sort of spills over into the public sphere. And by which I mean actors like Sean Hannity get a hold of it. And so Sean Hannity's Fox News show runs an entire episode on the Delta smelt, essentially, blaming all of California's problems, the Great Recession, everything that's wrong with America on protections of the Delta smelt. But the story that he told, and this gets back to storytelling, right, was essentially that liberals and Democrats and elected officials at the time Obama was president, they don't care about you. All they care about is this little fish, right? And so they took advantage of the fact that it was small, that it was uncharismatic, that it didn't have many uses, and it was sort of emblematic of what they thought was a kind of misplaced sort of sense of priorities. Farmers couldn't get water, so they said, because of this fish. Now, of course, there's a grain of truth in this because the Endangered Species Act is blind to, the charisma and size of species when it's protected. That's not what it's about, and it's also blind to the economic effects of protecting species. So there's a kind of, there's a reality that the way the law is set up, it is a fairly strict law, but it was, of course, woefully exaggerated, blown out of proportion in terms of percents. It's not the main constraint on water extraction from the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. There's plenty of water for farms and cities. And really, the Endangered Species Act is one of the levers that allows for the protection of this estuary, which is really, really degraded. So, I mean, it's the story they're telling is of course wildly false, but it resonates. It resonates. And so I looked at the controversy. And what I came to understand was that it wasn't really about the Delta smelt, and it wasn't really about water. Most people would look at the controversy and say, "Oh, this is the water wars," and there is some of that. There is, a conflict over water governance in California between environmental organizations and farmers and so on. But what made the controversy so explosive was that it resonated with a national partisan discourse. So you had people writing into their local newspaper in Florida about the Delta smelt. And you had people in national publications writing op-eds about it and so on. And I analyzed all the sort of opinion articles that were written about it. And I found out that if you were, the publications that were not in California or that were national, that were in other states, were more likely to be negative about the Delta smelt, even though the conflict only concerned Californians. I also found that people who published negative opinions about the Delta smelt were much more likely to discuss not just California water issues, but use it as an example among others and relate it to other hot button issues. So they would maybe bring up abortion or gun control or gay marriage, and the Delta smelt would be kind of like one issue among others that showed why the other side was bad. And so this worked to the advantage of an attempt, I think, to kind of like connect environmental issues to a sort of broader kind of partisan identity that was defined against, in this case, liberalism, right, against Democrats, but also to kind of connect it to a whole host of other issues that really didn't have much to do with water or endangered species. And so that led me to think, well, maybe the Delta Smelt is just one episode among others of how we kind of weave these kinds of senses of us and them, right, out of a disparate set of issues and conflicts that maybe we have very little stake in. But when someone mentions the Delta Smelt, right, or sorry, not Delta Smelt, when someone mentions water in California, you think of Delta Smelt, and then it activates a sense of partisan animosity. And then, this is something that's been picked up by President Trump on numerous occasions. And I think it is very, very effective. I mentioned the spotted owl before in relation to Pat Buchanan. I think that was a precursor to this, even though the case is quite a bit different. And so, I'm interested in that broader story. First of all, how was it possible that the Delta Smelt, came to resonate the way it did? But also, are there many other Delta Smelts or other episodes and issues that became kind of stitched together to give us a sense of environment as a divider, something that divides us, even though concretely, as you mentioned, as we talked about with the national parks, we share so much in common, and we own these things jointly, and we appreciate nature in ways that are not particularly that different, if we have different political views.
That's Caleb Scoville. He's a professor at Tufts University who's going to be spending the next 2 years delving into the question of environmental partisanship. Caleb, it's an interesting topic you've chosen, and I hope to return to visit to find out your takeaway and how we can solve these divisions.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk to you.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. Does Professor Scoville have a point? Are many of our opinions created by storytelling that might exaggerate things to cater to whether you're to the right or to the left? It'll certainly be interesting to see what he finds. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Travelers coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.